Hi folks, in this lesson we're going to add our first Angular material component. Let's get started. One of the new things we can do with the Angular CLI is to create some material components, including a navigation component. So that's what we're going to create first. We can generate the basic component using this command. This command will do a few things for us. It will create a new component called Nav and all of the files required for that, and it will update the main app module for the application. So we can see the new Nav folder now inside the app folder. And in the app.module file, we can see that it has added some dependencies from Angular material, and it's also added the new Nav component, and it's updated the imports array to add all of these new modules, and it's added the Nav component to the declarations array. The new component is relatively simple. It's got an observable property that is used in the template for determining whether the device being used is handheld or not. There's a couple of lint errors in this file. One of these is the selector for the component, which should be prefixed with app. So let's just add that. And there are also some empty white space characters. Let's just get rid of those. There's just one thing that we need to do before we can see the new Nav component. We need to use it somewhere. So we can add it to the app components template, replacing the existing placeholder content. So that should be everything that we need to do to get started. Let's go back to the browser now and preview the site at this point. So we can see that it's considerably changed. So it looks like it's missing the Angular material core theme. Let's just try stopping and starting the development server. We need to do that sometimes when new files get added, just because the new files might not necessarily get found by the application while it's running. And it looks like that's fixed the problem. So in the browser then, we can see that the application is now divided up into two main sections. We've got this menu section on the left here, and it contains some dummy links. And we have the main part of the application here, and it just has a header which says application title. So this is in the template for the Nav component. The template is quite complex. We have a number of directives in here that make use of the isHandset observable that was added to the Nav component for us. And it just changes the role of the side nav and the mode and whether it's opened by default or not. And we can see that the example links are added using a mat-nav-list, and that is in the mat-sidenav container. And we also have this mat toolbar, and that's what gives us the headings at the top of each section. We also have this mat-sidenav-content section, and that's where the main content for the page is. And we can see that there's also some behavior there that also uses the isHandset observable. And also we can see this hard-coded application title in the span. So let's just go back to the browser briefly. And let's just make the browser smaller. And we should find that when we get to a certain predefined breakpoints, then the view changes and the menu is no longer open by default. So now we just have a single header at the top, and we get this 3 lines button here. And when we click that, that's when the menu opens. So this is the standard for smaller devices where we might not necessarily want the menu open all the time because it takes up quite a bit of space. So it won't actually do anything yet, but we can see that that's what the observable in the component really is for. So the application should already have an application title, and this is in the app component. So let's import the app component into our Nav component. And let's inject this into the constructor for the nav component. So we already have this breakpoint observer there. And once we've done that, we can replace the hard-coded title in the template for the nav component with the title of the application from the app component. Let's just open up the app component as well. So we can see the title currently is app. Let's just update that to something a bit more illustrative of what the project is for. And now let's go back to the template for the nav component now. And we can replace the hard-coded text with an interpolation binding that binds to the title property of the app component. So let's go back to the browser now. And we can see that our application title has now been added to the template. Perfect. So let's go back to the template now. So there are some common conventions used by Angular material. Any component that comes from this framework is prefixed with mat hyphen at the start of the custom elements. So there's a number of these in here. As I said earlier, we have mat hyphen side nav hyphen container. That's the outer container for the whole side nav. And then inside this, we have a mat hyphen side nav. And inside this, we have a mat hyphen toolbar, mat hyphen nav hyphen list. And then as a sibling of the side nav, we have this mat hyphen side nav hyphen content element. Within this, there is another mat hyphen toolbar. And the way that the side nav component works is that the site content should go into this mat hyphen side nav hyphen content area. And that's for styling purposes. It doesn't really make any difference right now, but when we start to look at overlays, really for overlays to work correctly and for things like theming to work correctly, all of the main content for the application should be inside this mat hyphen side nav hyphen content area. So the side nav contains a number of property bindings. It has fixed in viewport, and that is set to the string true. The mode and opened properties, as well as the role attribute, are dynamically set using the isHandset observable. And there are some more properties that we can configure as well for this side nav. So the position property allows us to change which side of the screen the side nav is on. As we saw by default, it is at the left side of the screen. So I'm using a left to right language. So the left side of the screen is classed as start, and the default for the position property is set to start. But if we want the side nav to appear at the right of the screen instead, then we can set the position property to end. And now we can see the menu appears at the right of the screen. The styling is slightly different. The dividing line between the main content area and the navigation seems a little more muted, and there's no drop shadow. But aside from that, it should function in pretty much the same way. So the position property is an input property, but like any Angular component, the navigation component also supports some output properties. So these are like events. And if we want to bind to one of these outputs or events, we do that in the usual Angular way. So one of the output bindings that we can use is called opened start. And that allows us to associate a handler function in our component class with an event. So let's add a binding for that now. So we've added an output binding for the opened start event. That's why there are parentheses around it instead of square brackets. And we've specified a callback function that will be invoked whenever the menu is opened, called handleOpen. And that will be passed a draw object. The menu is built on a more generic Angular material component called a draw, and that's used in a number of other components as well. So the instance that gets passed to the handler is an instance of this draw object from which the menu is built. So let's go back to the class file now for the nav, and we can add an event handler called handleOpen. And let's just log this drawer object out. So let's go back to the browser now. And we can open up the console. And we should see our log message there straight away because the menu is opened by default. And let's just open up this side nav instance. And we can see that we get a number of different properties in here. So one thing to note at this point is that you can take a look at the full API documentation for the side nav and drawer components up on the Angular Material website. And we can see that we get an overview. We can look at the full API for the component. And we can also see some examples of how it should be used. So most of these open up on StackBlitz, but some of the more basic examples are rendered directly here. So generally, the documentation for any Angular Material component is very, very good. And we're just going to look at some of the more common use cases in this course. So if you're interested in finding out more about any of the components that we look at, the first place that you should come is the Angular Material documentation site. So in this lesson, we used our very first material component, the side nav, which we generated using the Angular CLI. We had a look at the class file that gets generated for us and the template, and we looked at how the component is styled and how it functions to a basic level. We also saw how we can configure input properties and bind to output events. Thanks for watching.